Corporate power is really central to understanding the American experience.
Corporations have a very proactive power in that the investments that they make, which for people means where their businesses are located, who they employ, that investment is under their private control. That's very distinct to the U.S., where corporations have at least among developed countries, where corporations have such private control over their investment. That means they get to call the shots, and government and citizens generally play a reactive role to that.
And the source of corporate power is that they run our economy. They have trillions and trillions of dollars at their disposal. They, most of the U.S. labor force works for private corporations. They have enormous influence over our government. So they have resources. They make enormously important decisions. The goods and services we buy are largely produced by corporations. I'm an economist, so I have a little bit of maybe a bias in my perspective, but I think the organization of our economy and our entire society really hinges on the kinds of decisions that corporations make and the incredible clout that their wealth gives them.
Citizens have this perception that corporations can just buy elected officials. Corporate contributions in electoral campaigns, which are huge and are still dwarfed by all the money corporations and industries put into day-to-day lobbying. That's a massive industry, and it sustains a lot of consultants and companies on K Street in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. These are now really entrenched industries of their own, and they are kind of the front lines of corporate power. So there's an evolution of growing state power and ability to resist corporate initiative. And then in response, we see, further development of corporate power, specifically into political spheres. And this establishment of corporations as individuals is a legal foundation in that. It wasn't necessarily meant to be as insidious as we think of now when we think of, say, the notorious Citizens United case, which gave corporations the right of free speech. Almost certainly no one who developed laws or supported laws granting corporations individuality in an economic liability contractual sense anticipated that would be, it would have consequences for corporate lobbying, corporate advertising, and particularly around campaigns, corporate funding of pro-incumbent or pro-challenger cases. So that's arguably an unanticipated consequences unanticipated consequence of what was originally a very forward-thinking but maybe a little more innocent or at least narrower reason for establishing corporations as an individual.
If you're concerned about racism, concerned about gender relations, concerned about inequality, concerned about democracy, corporations have an interest in how we structure, regulate, all of those things. And they have billions and trillions of dollars at stake, and they use that wealth and their political influence to frame the discussion, to influence legislation, and so I don't think you can understand any important social issue without considering the role of corporate power.
So we've talked about some of the benefits that can be had from empowering corporations. What would you say are the downsides, and how would you say the benefits and the downsides are distributed among sectors of our population?
The general principle of thinking about the harmful byproducts of corporations is the idea of the negative externality. They are not required to pay for the costs that they create. So the environmental justice movement has documented these very powerful correlations between the location of LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, and specifically noxious industries, resource extraction, factories that pollute, on the one hand, and vulnerable populations, and as you mentioned specifically, populations of color. Affluent populations are very rarely willing to put up with locally unwanted land uses. But more to the point, they have the political and economic muscle to put their money where their mouth is. They can make planning those locally unwanted land uses a real headache for these kinds of industries. They may have connections with the elected officials. They certainly have the education and the cultural capital to know how to, make an effective presentation at a public hearing on these siting issues. The history of this country, and of course this is a history that precedes corporations as we know them. The history of this country is one in which economic exploitation has been intimately tied with race and racism. And so even today we live with this legacy of populations of color being the most economically vulnerable, and race still being a wedge to divide vulnerable populations.
And what's of most concern to sociologists is the influence that social factors have on us, and factors like gender. How does that enter into what's going on in terms of our environment? And what we know is that marginalized groups are simply far less likely to have the resources in order to mobilize against environmental hazards. So there are many differences in terms of environmental quality of different locations that have directly to do, for example, with race and with racism. And this became evident, and I guess was first widely talked about in the early 1980s, when the first national study was done that revealed that race was the most powerful variable in determining where hazardous wastes are dumped in the United States. So more powerful than poverty, more powerful than land values, more powerful even than home ownership was the factor of race. And since then, it's been documented that race influences not only the siting of hazardous waste dumps, but also whether or not environmental regulations are likely to be enforced, whether or not you're likely to be exposed to environmental hazards, and also your accessibility to health care. So race has been found to be independent of class variables in the distribution of air pollution, when it comes to contaminated fish consumption, when it comes to municipal incinerators, cleanup of Superfunds, or lead poisoning in children. All of these things are directly correlated with race. And one other thing too is that shipping hazardous wastes from richer communities to poorer communities or to Native American reservations is a clear manifestation of power arrangements and the whole larger structure of social stratification. Who's got the power, who's got the wealth, and who doesn't.
No one wants to locate a toxic incinerator in Beverly Hills. They always want to do it where the people of color live.
Marx had a phrase, non-reformist reforms, by which he meant changes that are meant to appease and sort of diffuse the power of a movement.
The U.S. is often remarked as one of the more entrepreneurial environments. Business people can fail, and then rather than be ruined for life, they can just declare bankruptcy and start up again. So a lot of important social goods are dependent upon where corporations invest. This larger institutional framework, which puts government in a reactive position, often leads to scenarios like the race to the bottom, which is an expression we use to understand how you can have two states or two municipalities just outbidding each other and how far they can give away the shop, so to speak, in terms of subsidies and public investments that can be made for a corporate investment. No single corporation generally has created that environment. That's there's arguably a long legal and cultural history in this country of promoting that kind of entrepreneurial environment, and we see it, that's part of the story of the 19th century. This is all part of a larger institutional context that any one corporation would be foolish not to exploit. I mean, that's how margins are met and how, tax burdens can be lowered. But they're not necessarily the creators of that environment. There's a larger history of that in this country.
I'm very much of the belief that corporations are typically just pursuing the bottom line, and I think that often means, focus a lot, building in low-income areas because that's where the land is cheaper. And insofar as low-income areas are often correlated with race, then it's plausible. Then I think it makes sense that a lot of that there might be disproportionate impacts on certain races rather than others. I guess I wouldn't call that racism necessarily. I would call that low-incomeism, but I agree that's a problem. I agree also. I think also we're talking earlier about the political problem, that the fact that certain races may have less political power, and corporations may focus their buildings in areas with, where they get less political opposition. That's a problem as well. But I guess for me, that's a problem with the political system, where we should make sure that we should design a political system where all races are represented equally. And I think it's not the corporations are not central to that problem.
What would you say needs to be done to ensure that people of color aren't disproportionately impacted by the impacts of industrialization? I
guess I would advocate for political systems that are as fair and equitable as possible. I guess my ideal world is that we should just hire economists, right, to make all these decisions. And I guess I'd like to believe that as an economist I would make fair decisions where we sort of treat everybody equally, we sort of measure the costs and benefits to everyone fairly, and that's how it works. But I also know that in the real world that never happens that way. There's this view that some people have that expecting corporations to take into account these things may not be the best way. I mean, there's opposing views, right? So I taught before here. I taught at Cornell and I did my grad school at Stanford, and they're big advocates of corporate social responsibility and this idea that corporations should sort of take into account should be socially responsible. But economists also sort of worry about that a little bit because they think that that's government's role and that's not corporations' role, because it's, again, a corporation is big, but it's only one business and they can't really see the whole picture, whereas government can see the whole picture better.
The practical answer is, of course, that corporations are now fully, implicated in the support and policy agenda and political viability of a lot of elected officials. And so it does get a little trickier. Whereas in principle, this is a public policy issue. Anyone who takes this on starts to realize there's real private sector muscle behind maintaining the policy status quo.
As an economist, I guess I would like every decision to be balanced where the costs and benefits are equally balanced on both sides. And I see that in the US we have mechanisms to sort of balance the power of corporations, but whether they balance it enough, that's a hard question to answer.
For these reasons, corporate protests are absolutely crucial. Do they actually, put the squeeze on the most important levers of power? Not necessarily. Do they highlight these larger questions of, who benefits from this policy context? And is this a legitimate policy context? Is this something people are willing to accept? In fact, I think you find a lot of people and social movements are able to exert some influence through these private sector campaigns, trying to highlight their conflicts and their struggle against corporations.
Corporations are interested in making money, and they generally don't think, are we making America more democratic? Are we enriching people's lives? So the role of corporations in the future is that they're going to be right at the center of the struggle. They have billions and trillions of dollars at stake. One way you can understand U.S. history, and in fact the history of the global economy, is as a struggle between corporations who are trying to make money and human beings, social movements, labor unions, human rights organizations, environmental rights organizations struggling to constrain and regulate and limit what corporations are allowed to do in the pursuit of profit. This is a struggle that has a lot of fronts. We need to do a number of things. One is we need to continue to put pressure on our legislators, and this is not a particularly radical, but I think can often be an effective means to put pressure on our legislators to recognize that it's their responsibility to regulate corporations so that when they make decisions that create jobs for us and create the goods and services we consume, that they do it in a way that's consistent with making life rich for the typical American.
And over the last 2 years, year and a half, I realized that divestment is not just about global warming. It's not just about letting ourselves off the hook for being involved in it. It's not even about making an economic impact or a direct economic impact on the fossil fuel industry. It's about being part of a massive symbolic movement and a massive push for pressure on the government to regulate fossil fuels and to desubsidize the fossil fuel industry, which, as I'll talk about, is really an issue of social justice. So if we care about social justice at Vassar, if we're trying to fight bigotry and racism, neocolonialism, all of those things, divestment sits at the nexus of it, and fossil fuel corporations are the reason it's happening.
I think of a radical change as being something that really gets at the root of the system, that really challenges the structure of the system. We can make considerable progress by using techniques that are quite mainstream, putting pressure on our legislators. I think taxing corporations more heavily, investing more in public schools, reducing tuition at public universities, investing more heavily, having the federal government invest more heavily in alternative energies. I don't think any of those things are particularly radical, but I think they can be really enormously effective. I also think we really need to be open to challenging the essential guiding principle of our economy, which is the economy is run by corporations that are profit-making. And so I think we need to look at lots of areas of the world and say, is this really the kind of thing that we want, where we want the profit motive to rule?
The basis of divestment is that once you recognize that a company's practices are morally unacceptable, you would withdraw your funds from that, so withdraw your support and make a political statement. Do you think that's radical?
So, I have to say that over time, I have become a little bit less concerned about the distinction between liberal and radical, and am much more interested in what works, because it will raise awareness and it creates the potential for other institutions to do it. It raises the potential for, if other institutions of higher learning are doing it, for other nonprofits doing it, and municipal governments doing it, and then again shining a bright light. I mean, I think the awareness, the potential to raise awareness and put pressure on fossil fuel companies and to behave differently, behave more responsibly, putting pressure on legislators to incentivize and invest in other kinds of other sources of energy, is related to the magnitude of the movement in terms of dollars. So I think if Vassar gets involved and other small liberal arts colleges and other large universities, it's got the potential to be the spark that starts the fire.
Usually people think of symbolic as meaning, feudal. Sociologists see things a little different. Symbolism is how we sort of consent to everyday life. And so, making these protests, they increase education, they increase awareness, and they withhold the kind of tacit day-to-day consent to the way things are that otherwise all of us are involved in every day.
I worry that divestment might be really expensive. So I don't know the numbers. I don't run our budget. I don't run the school's budget. I haven't seen the school's budget. But if divestment sort of reduces the returns to the endowment, and it means, let's say, even like a tiny percent, it grows by 1% less than it would normally. That could be tens of thousands of dollars, right? That could be a scholarship for a student. That could be, a professor hiring another professor for another year. That could be somebody like a staff member losing their job or losing their benefits. And I think those are real costs, and we should weigh those real costs against whatever benefits. So I think the idea of advocating for environmental justice is a good one, but I think there might be other ways to do it. Making movies, like writing a congressman, like doing things like that might work better than divestment.
One of the things that I seem to recall from the apartheid divestment campaigns, you had a very particular domestic environment in South Africa. You had a majority of the population who was in support of a global boycott of their country's industries. They knew they would suffer economically, possibly, but they knew that was a valid sacrifice for this larger goal. Do you have a domestic population in that target nation that's willing to accept that? That is, in fact, encouraging it. I think one of the reasons why people are looking at colleges to make the move is because, they are a place where protesters can make exert pressure on a pretty sizable source of investment capital.
So the last reason to divest is that this may be the most powerful any of us in this room ever get, because we're part of an institution. We're part of a large, fairly influential, pretty rich institution that has a voice. If I jumped up and down and said, boo fossil fuels alone, I would have no power. Vassar's got a pretty big voice. Middlebury's got a pretty big voice. Haverford's got a pretty big voice. Swarthmore's got a pretty big voice. The city of Seattle and San Francisco all have pretty big voices. When a lot of divestment campaigns join together, we start to have a voice, and that voice can disentangle the fossil fuel industry from the government, provide real change in the way fossil fuel industry is regulated, and in the subsidy structure of our energy system. So I think that is really important to keep in mind. If you want to make a change, this is the time and this is the place to do it.
Big institutional investors, but just our own investments are implicated in that.